A letter arrives at dusk, and with it, a secret no one dares speak of. Welcome to Fabled Codex. I am your host, Mithrin. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Your words make these mysteries come alive. Now let's begin. The morning sun rose gently over the village of St. Mary Mead, washing the thatched rooftops in a soft golden hue. The air was alive with the sounds of laughter, birdsong, and the faint clinking of teacups. It was the day of the annual garden fete, the event of the season, where the villagers gathered to admire prize-winning roses, gossip freely under striped tents, and sample Mrs. Bartlett's infamous gooseberry jam. Miss Jane Marple, dressed in a lavender hat and carrying her parasol, walked slowly along the path leading to the vicarage lawn. Her eyes, as sharp and blue as the summer sky, seemed to take in every detail, from the nervous flick of young Lucy Harcourt's eyes to the smudge of dirt on Major Denby's polished shoes. To most, she was merely the kindly spinster who knitted baby clothes for charity and spoke of her late nephew in the Navy. To those who knew better, Miss Marple was something of an enigma, a woman whose soft voice and mild manners belied a mind as precise as a clock and as incisive as a scalpel. The fete was in full swing. Children darted between stalls, ribbons flying. The brass band played a cheery tune slightly off-key. Mr. Clement, the vicar, stood by the tombola, trying in vain to stop Mrs. Price Ridley from monopolizing the conversation about the moral decay of modern youth. Near the tea tent, Colonel Harcourt, owner of Blackthorn Cottage, a handsome stone house on the edge of the village, was holding court among the local gentry, glass of sherry in hand. Blackthorn Cottage had been the subject of much talk of late. Once a proud family estate, it had passed through several hands after the tragic death of Mrs. Harcourt, some years before. A fall from the balcony that had never quite been explained to everyone's satisfaction. Since then the Colonel had lived alone, save for his niece Lucy, who had recently returned from London. Her appearance, pale, refined, and oddly withdrawn, had revived the villagers' appetite for gossip. Just as the judging of the flower arrangements began, a shriek tore through the hum of the fete. It came from the direction of the tea tent. Within moments the crowd gathered. Mrs. Bartlett, her apron stained with raspberry trifle, was trembling violently. At her feet lay Colonel Harcourt, sprawled across the grass, his face ashen, and his hand still clutching the remains of a scone. The faint scent of almonds hung in the air, unmistakable even amid the fragrance of roses and fresh-cut grass. "Good heavens!" cried the vicar, kneeling beside him. "Call Dr. Haydock at once." Miss Marple stood a few steps away, her expression unreadable. She watched as the confusion erupted. Voices rising, accusations whispered. "Poison," someone said. "Cyanide," another murmured. Mrs. Price Ridley was already asserting that she had always suspected something peculiar about the Colonel's will. But Miss Marple's gaze lingered not on the fallen man, nor on the terrified crowd. Instead, she looked toward the tea-table, at the untouched cup of tea beside the Colonel's, and the faint imprint of lipstick on its rim. She sighed softly and adjusted her hat. "Poor man," she murmured to no one in particular. "But I dare say it's not the first time a heart has failed at a garden party, though rarely from natural causes." And with that she turned away. Her mind already knitting the first threads of a puzzle she would quietly, inexorably, unravel. Would you like me to continue with Section 2, The Village Reacts, where gossip spreads and suspicions begin to take shape? The following morning dawned grey and restless, as though the skies themselves shared in the village's unease. St. Mary Mead was rarely without its chatter, but today the hum of gossip had reached a fevered pitch. Everywhere, from the post-office queue to the grocer's counter, the same words circulated in hushed tones. Colonel Harcourt dead at the garden fete, poisoned. No one could quite believe it, and yet every villager seemed to possess an opinion, a theory, or some recollection that suddenly felt more significant than it had 24 hours earlier. At the vicarage breakfast table, Miss Marple stirred her tea gently, her eyes distant though her manner remained serene. Mrs. Clement, fluttering as always, was recounting the latest rumour she had heard from Mrs. Price Ridley, something about a quarrel between the Colonel and his niece. Apparently, Mrs. Clement said in a stage whisper, Lucy was seen arguing with her uncle near the Rose Arch just before tea was served. Mrs. Bartlett insists she overheard it. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Mrs. Bartlett overhears many things, she said softly, though whether she understands what she hears is another matter entirely. The vicar frowned. Still, it's rather serious, Jane. The poor girl's already under suspicion, I fear. The police are at Blackthorn Cottage this morning, questioning everyone in sight. Quite right, Miss Marple replied, setting down her spoon with delicate precision. One must always begin with those closest to the deceased, though it's curious how often that leads us astray. The truth, you see, has a way of hiding in plain sight, usually behind someone's good manners. She rose, took her shawl from the chair, and murmured that she would walk into the village for a few errands. The vicar knew better than to ask further questions. Miss Marple's errands, especially after a murder, were never merely about groceries. As she strolled down the lane, the morning mist lifted to reveal the familiar faces of St. Mary Mead, each one altered slightly by yesterday's shock. Mr. Trelawney, the retired solicitor, stood outside the post office pretending to read the Times, though his eyes darted eagerly from one passer-by to the next. Miss Hartnell, the dressmaker, was deep in conversation with the butcher's wife, both of them leaning close, their voices lowered yet urgent. Even the milkman paused in his rounds to share his opinion that the Colonel always had enemies. And what with that business in India, well, it was bound to catch up with him. Miss Marple paused at the greengrocer's, selected a small basket of apples, and engaged Mr. Pritchard in mild conversation. He was a plump, anxious man who had delivered vegetables to Blackthorn Cottage for over a decade. Terrible business, Miss Marple, he said, shaking his head. The Colonel seemed right as rain only yesterday morning, ordered his usual carrots, and told me Lucy was back for good this time. Odd way to put it, don't you think? Perhaps he meant it as reassurance, Miss Marple said gently. Families do like to believe in permanence, though life rarely obliges. From the greengrocer's she made her way toward the churchyard path that led to Blackthorn Cottage. She didn't intend to intrude, of course, merely to pass by, but as she reached the gate, the unmistakable figure of Inspector Craddock appeared at the doorway, tall, brisk, and faintly harassed. He noticed her immediately and sighed, though there was an almost affectionate resignation in his tone when he greeted her. Miss Marple, I might have known you'd appear sooner or later. Good morning, Inspector, she said pleasantly. I was merely out for a walk. Such a peaceful morning after such a dreadful day, don't you find? He gave her a look that balanced irritation with amusement. Peaceful, perhaps, but far from clear. The autopsy confirmed it, cyanide. We found traces in the Colonel's teacup and a small residue on the spoon. Someone laced his cup right there at the fete. Miss Marple nodded. How dreadful. Though I suppose poison, especially something with that bitter almond scent, isn't easily concealed. True enough, Craddock said. But what puzzles me is how no one noticed. Mrs. Bartlett swears she poured both cups herself, but Lucy claims she handed one to her uncle while speaking with Mrs. Price Ridley. We've also found out that the Colonel had recently changed his will, left most of the estate to Lucy, except for a certain annuity promised to his housekeeper. That's motive enough for half the village to talk. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. And for the other half to embellish, I imagine. Craddock sighed. It's the same old story. Everyone saw something, no two accounts agree. But if Lucy Harcourt did it, she's either extraordinarily foolish or extraordinarily confident. She hasn't shed a tear, and she speaks as though nothing in the world has touched her. Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the windows of the cottage. Grief has many faces, Inspector. Some of them quite calm. He gave her a searching look. You think she's innocent? I think, Miss Marple said gently, that innocence is rarely tidy and guilt even less so. But I'm sure you'll come to your conclusions soon enough. The truth always emerges once people begin to talk freely. With that, she bade him good morning and continued down the path, her mind quietly sifting through the fragments of conversation she had gathered. By midday, the village was abuzz once more. At the Bluebell tea rooms, Mrs. Price Ridley, Mrs. Bartlett, and Miss Hartnell were engaged in what could only be described as a council of war. Cups clinked, scones crumbled, and speculation thickened like clotted cream. "It's obvious, really," Mrs. Price Ridley declared, her voice rising above the gentle tinkle of the piano. "Lucy must have done it. Young women from London always bring trouble. She probably wanted the inheritance outright." Mrs. Bartlett shook her head. "Oh, I don't know. She looked frightened when the colonel fell. And she was pale, white as chalk. But that maid of theirs, now there's a sly one. Keeps to herself, always listening." Miss Hartnell leaned in conspiratorially. "Or what about Dr. Haydock? He arrived suspiciously quickly, almost as if he knew what had happened." Miss Marple, who had entered unnoticed and taken a small table by the window, listened while pretending to concentrate on her pot of tea. Her eyes flickered toward the mirror behind the counter, which afforded a clear reflection of the gossiping trio. She didn't need to look directly at them. She knew their voices well enough. Each word, each phrase revealed not just what they knew, but what they feared. It was then that young Lucy herself appeared at the doorway. Her face was drawn, her manner hesitant but dignified. The entire room seemed to stiffen as she crossed the threshold. She ordered tea, sat near the back, and said nothing. Mrs. Bartlett whispered something to Mrs. Price Ridley, who pursed her lips and looked away. Miss Marple observed quietly. Lucy's hands trembled slightly as she lifted her cup. There was grief there, yes, but also something deeper. Not guilt exactly, but strain. The kind that comes from holding back truth rather than concealing crime. When Miss Marple finished her tea, she rose and approached the girl. "My dear," she said kindly, "I was so very sorry to hear of your uncle's death. You must be quite exhausted." Lucy looked up, startled, and nodded. "Thank you, Miss Marple. It's all been so sudden. I can hardly believe it happened." "I quite understand," Miss Marple said softly. "Loss has a peculiar way of clouding our memories, doesn't it? One remembers odd little things like the color of a tablecloth or a turn of phrase, but not the thing one should remember." Lucy blinked rapidly, then looked down. "Yes, it's strange. I keep thinking about his teacup. He asked for sugar twice, which he never does. I remember because I thought it odd at the time." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "And did you fetch the sugar?" Lucy hesitated. "No, Mrs. Bartlett did. She handed it to him herself." "Ah," Miss Marple said. "Thank you, my dear. You've been most helpful. And remember, people often see what they expect to see. Sometimes the truth is merely what no one thought to question." As she left the tea room, the church clock struck 3. The sun had broken through the clouds, casting long shadows across the lane. Miss Marple paused for a moment, glancing toward the distant silhouette of Blackthorn Cottage, a poisoned cup, a curious change in the will, a trembling hand, and an insistence on sugar. Small things, tiny, almost invisible, but as Miss Marple well knew, it was the small things that told the largest truths, and somewhere within those quiet details, a secret waited patiently to be found. That afternoon, a stillness settled over St. Mary Mead, a kind of wary calm that comes after the first shock has worn away, when curiosity begins to sharpen into suspicion. The village lanes, usually alive with chatter and the clop of a delivery cart, seemed quieter than usual. But behind lace curtains and half-open windows, whispers persisted. No one could quite agree on what to believe, yet everyone felt certain that something dreadful and very personal had occurred among them. Miss Marple returned home just after 4, her knitting basket in hand, though it was more habit than necessity. She preferred to think while her fingers worked, and today there was much to consider. The colonel's death had been too convenient, too public, and far too sudden. The setting, a garden fete, was the perfect camouflage. Chaos, movement, distraction, and above all, tea. People rarely question what is placed before them, when it's served with a smile and a biscuit. She sat by her window overlooking the vicarage garden, the faint scent of lavender drifting through the open pane. From there she could see Mrs. Price Ridley marching purposefully toward the churchyard, no doubt to confer with the vicar about the moral decline of the younger generation, though in truth, Miss Marple suspected she wished to share whatever tidbit she had most recently acquired. Miss Marple smiled to herself, a small knowing smile. In a village like St. Mary Mead, information flowed more swiftly than any police report ever could. It was nearly 5 when a soft knock came at her door. Opening it, she found Inspector Craddock once again, his expression weary but alert. "May I come in, Miss Marple? I thought you might like to hear how matters are progressing." "Of course, Inspector," she said, motioning toward the sitting room. "Do sit down. I've just put the kettle on." He hesitated before accepting, his large frame looking oddly out of place among her floral chairs and lace doilies. "It's been a long day," he admitted, rubbing his temples. "We've learned that the poison was administered in the Colonel's cup, not the teapot. Mrs. Bartlett insists she poured both cups herself, but we've reason to believe someone interfered after that." Miss Marple poured the tea, her hands perfectly steady. "And who might have had the opportunity?" "Almost everyone," he said grimly. The tea tent was crowded. People came and went. At one point, Mrs. Bartlett turned her back to fetch more sugar. The Colonel's cup was left unattended for perhaps 30 seconds. "Quite enough time," Miss Marple said. He nodded. "We've also discovered something else. It seems the Colonel had received a letter that morning, a rather unpleasant one, burned half to ashes in the grate, but we managed to piece together a few words. You'll pay for what happened at Blackthorn and justice. We don't yet know who sent it." Miss Marple's eyes flickered. A threat, then. How curious that he chose to attend the fete regardless. Most men would stay home nursing their dignity, or their fear. Courageous or foolhardy, Craddock agreed. "We also interviewed Lucy again. She denies any knowledge of the will change, but the solicitor confirmed she was informed only 2 days before the fete. She inherits nearly everything except a modest sum left to Mrs. Briggs, the housekeeper." "Mrs. Briggs," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. "She's been with the family since before Mrs. Harcourt's death, hasn't she?" "Nearly 15 years. Loyal as they come, or so everyone says. But we can't discount anyone." He paused, studying her face. "You've seen more of these village affairs than I care to count, Miss Marple. Does this one strike you as, how shall I put it, domestic?" She smiled faintly. "All murders are domestic, Inspector. Even when they masquerade as business or revenge, they're born out of personal entanglement. We kill those we know or think we know. It's much too difficult otherwise." He exhaled slowly, leaning back. "That's what I was afraid you'd say." When he left, Miss Marple remained by the fire, the soft clatter of her knitting needles resuming. She thought of Lucy, the trembling hands, the unguarded remark about the sugar, and the curious absence of visible grief. And then Mrs. Bartlett, whose eagerness to recount details had the faint air of someone rehearsing rather than remembering. There was something there, a subtle discord between what was said and what was meant. At dusk, Miss Marple decided on a small walk to clear her mind. The lanes glowed amber in the fading light, and a faint mist crept along the hedgerows. She found herself near the vicarage, where she encountered Dr. Haydock locking his bicycle outside the gate. "Evening, Miss Marple," he said, tipping his hat. "I see you've survived the day's theatrics. I've spent the afternoon trying to calm nerves and prevent heart attacks that exist only in imagination." Miss Marple gave a soft chuckle. "I dare say the village is more alive than ever, though some might wish to prove otherwise. You examined the Colonel, I believe?" "Yes," he said gravely. "Classic cyanide poisoning, quick, almost instantaneous. There was no chance of revival. The dose was strong enough for a horse. Whoever administered it knew precisely what they were doing." "Meaning," she said, That it wasn't a spur-of-the-moment impulse. Exactly. This was planned. And not just planned, but timed. The fete was the perfect distraction. Anyone could have done it and slipped away unnoticed. She nodded slowly. "You've known the Harcourts a long time, haven't you, Doctor?" "Since before Mrs. Harcourt's death. Tragic business, that was. A fall. Though I never quite believed it was entirely accidental. The Colonel blamed himself for years, poor devil." Did he indeed? Miss Marple's tone was mild, but her eyes glinted. "And did others blame him too?" "Some did," Haydock admitted. Mrs. Harcourt's brother, for one, never forgave him. They quarrelled bitterly over the estate afterward. The brother went abroad, I think. India or Burma. No one's heard from him in years. "Ah, the past," Miss Marple said softly. "It never quite stays buried, does it?" The doctor gave her a searching look. "You have that expression again, Miss Marple. The one that means you've thought of something you're not telling me." She smiled. "Nonsense, Doctor. I was merely thinking of how often the roots of trouble stretch further back than anyone suspects. A murder, like a weed, rarely grows in isolation." When he departed, Miss Marple walked on a little further until she reached the low stone wall surrounding Blackthorn Cottage. Lights glimmered faintly through the downstairs windows. She could see the outline of Lucy seated by the fire, her head bowed, while Mrs. Briggs moved about the room with deliberate care, arranging tea things on a tray. There was an intimacy to the scene, a shared silence that suggested loyalty, perhaps even protection. And yet, something in Lucy's posture, the stiffness of her shoulders, made Miss Marple's heart tighten. Later that night, as the church bell tolled 9, a new stir rippled through the village. Word spread quickly. The Colonel's safe had been opened and several important papers were missing. The constable posted at the cottage swore no one had entered or left, yet the lock was forced. Inspector Craddock was summoned at once. Miss Marple, sitting quietly by her lamp, heard the hurried footsteps outside and the murmur of voices. She rose, drew her curtains slightly aside, and watched as shadows flickered across the lane. The investigation was deepening now, spreading like ripples across a pond. Someone had grown nervous, perhaps desperate. She sat down again and folded her hands, eyes half closed in thought. The pieces were still scattered. A letter of threat, a poisoned cup, a missing set of documents, and a family secret whispered but never told. It would all, she knew, come together soon. The truth always did, once human folly had run its course. Miss Marple reached for her knitting once more, her needles clicking softly in the quiet room. Outside, a wind rose over St. Mary Mead, stirring the hedges and carrying with it the faint scent of roses from the vicarage garden, the same roses that had framed the fate and the death that began it all. Somewhere, among those delicate petals and polite facades, lay the hand that had poured the fatal cup, and Miss Marple, with her patient, unhurried wisdom, was already drawing closer to finding it. The following morning broke cold and pale, the kind of English dawn that seemed hesitant to commit to daylight. A mist hung low over the cottages, curling around hedgerows like a living thing. From her bedroom window, Miss Marple watched the faint movement of figures outside Blackthorn Cottage. Inspector Craddock, 2 constables, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Briggs, all bundled in coats against the chill. The inspector's stance told her all she needed to know. Something had been discovered, and whatever it was, it had unsettled him. She dressed promptly, her movements unhurried but purposeful. By the time she reached the cottage, the inspector was emerging, his notebook tucked under his arm, his brow furrowed in deep thought. He saw her approaching and sighed as though expecting her. "Good morning again, Miss Marple. I might have known you'd be about." "I find fresh air does wonders for one's understanding," she said mildly. "And of course one never knows what the morning might reveal." He gave a half smile. "In this case it's trouble. The safe was forced during the night, and the contents, mostly papers, are gone. But what puzzles me most is this: no sign of a break-in. Every door and window locked from the inside." Miss Marple tilted her head, peering past him toward the cottage. Curious indeed. And was anything else disturbed? Nothing of value, oddly enough. There was a small cash box untouched on the same shelf. Whoever did this wasn't after money. Information, then, she murmured, more to herself than to him. The most dangerous currency of all. Craddock gave her a sharp look. You think the thief was after the Colonel's documents? I should imagine so. Blackthorn Cottage has seen more than one unpleasantness, hasn't it? It's possible something written long ago was never meant to see the light of day. He frowned. You're thinking of Mrs. Harcourt's death? I'm thinking, she said gently, that the past has an inconvenient way of inserting itself into the present, particularly when people would rather it did not. Inside the cottage, the air was heavy with the faint scent of coal and lemon polish. Mrs. Briggs, a stout woman with kind eyes and a nervous flutter to her hands, was fussing with the hearth. Oh, Miss Marple, she said anxiously, it's been dreadful. I locked up tight last night, I swear it. The Colonel always said I was to keep things proper. And now this, after all that's happened? Why, I can hardly think straight. Miss Marple laid a comforting hand on her arm. You've had quite a shock, my dear. I dare say no one's blaming you. Tell me, though, was there anything in that safe the Colonel kept particularly close? Mrs. Briggs bit her lip. Only his papers, ma'am. He'd got some letters from his time abroad, and old ledgers from when he managed the plantations. Oh, and something else. There was a small tin box locked up tight. I never saw inside, but he was very particular about it. Wouldn't even let me dust it. A tin box, Miss Marple repeated softly. And now it's gone? Yes, ma'am. Gone without a trace. At that moment Lucy appeared in the doorway. She looked pale but composed, dressed in dark mourning that made her seem older than her years. Her eyes flickered toward the inspector, then to Miss Marple. I don't understand any of it, she said quietly. The doors were bolted when I came down this morning. Mrs. Briggs and I were the only ones in the house. Are you saying someone broke in and then out without leaving a mark? Not necessarily, Miss Marple said, studying her carefully. Sometimes people needn't break in at all. Sometimes they're already inside. The girl stiffened slightly, but Miss Marple's voice remained calm, almost sympathetic. Tell me, my dear, did your uncle ever mention this tin box? Lucy hesitated, then shook her head. No, but I remember seeing it once when I was a child. He took it out one evening, after my aunt's death. I thought it was a jewelry case, though he snapped it shut the moment I asked about it. He said it contained the truth of things best forgotten. I never knew what he meant. Craddock scribbled a note. And you've no idea who could have taken it? No, she said softly, but there was someone outside last night. I heard footsteps on the gravel near my window. I thought I imagined it. It was late and I'd taken something to help me sleep. Did you tell anyone? Lucy shook her head again. No, I didn't want to make a fuss. Miss Marple watched her closely, her expression unreadable. Then she turned toward the fireplace, where a small pile of ash caught her attention. Inspector, would you mind terribly if I looked at that? He gestured for her to proceed. Miss Marple bent slowly, her fingers brushing aside the ashes, until she found a fragment of paper, charred but legible enough to show a few words. Gus, confess, accident. Not her fault. She read the words softly, her brow knitting. Looks like a piece of one of those missing documents, Craddock said. Why burn it? Because, Miss Marple said, straightening, some truths are not meant to be shared, especially when they threaten reputations. Craddock gave a frustrated sigh. We're chasing shadows, Miss Marple. Every clue leads back to that house and its secrets. Perhaps that's where you should keep looking, she said gently. But not for fingerprints or footprints. You'll find no evidence of guilt on the carpet. It lingers instead in the heart. She left soon after, walking slowly back toward the village. The air had warmed slightly, and a thin ray of sunlight filtered through the mist. Her mind moved swiftly, sorting impressions and recollections. The Colonel's changed will, the mysterious letter of threat, Lucy's trembling hand, Mrs. Bartlett's conveniently selective memory, and now this, the vanished box and the burnt confession. It was all of a piece, she was certain, though the pattern was still faint. When she reached the post office, she found Mrs. Bartlett inside, buying stamps and speaking with unnecessary brightness. "Ah, Miss Marple," she said, her smile a shade too wide. "Dreadful business, isn't it? Poor Colonel Harcourt. And now this nonsense about burglars. Why, I can hardly sleep at night." Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "Indeed, though I dare say burglars are not the only things keeping people awake." Mrs. Bartlett flushed slightly. "I beg your pardon?" "Oh, nothing at all," Miss Marple said, her tone airy. "Only I've always thought it must be dreadful to know something one cannot quite say, especially when it concerns one's own actions." The woman's expression hardened for a moment, then softened again. "So you have the strangest way of talking, Miss Marple." "So I'm told," she said cheerfully, paying for her own letter. "But I find people often listen more closely when they think I'm not saying anything important." As she stepped outside, she saw the vicar's wife hurrying down the lane toward her. "Jane, have you heard?" The constable found footprints near the churchyard, men's boots, heavy ones, leading toward the cottage lane. "They think the thief may have escaped that way." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Perhaps, or perhaps he never left at all." Mrs. Clement blinked. "I don't understand." "Few do at first," Miss Marple murmured, "but the truth has a way of circling back, like the church bell's echo. It always finds the one who tried to hide from it." That evening, as the shadows deepened and lamps flickered in cottage windows, Miss Marple sat once more by her fire, a fresh cup of tea beside her. She thought again of Lucy. Her composure, her fear, and the curious phrasing she'd used that morning, the truth of things best forgotten. That phrase, Miss Marple knew, had not been hers. It had belonged to the Colonel. And it was not about guilt, but protection. Outside the wind rose again, brushing against the panes with a hollow sigh. Somewhere in the darkness between truth and deception, Miss Marple felt the faint click of understanding, like the turn of a key in a lock. The pattern was beginning to take shape, and when it did, she would be ready to see it for what it was, not just a murder, but a reckoning long delayed. That night the wind turned restless, sweeping down the lanes of St. Mary Mead and rattling loose shutters, as if to remind the village that peace, once disturbed, rarely returns easily. In her quiet sitting room, Miss Marple sat very still, her knitting forgotten on her lap. The fire had burned low, and the shadows on the wall seemed to shift and breathe. She had been turning the same thought over for hours now, one small persistent inconsistency that refused to settle. A safe forced from the inside, papers burned but not completely, and a phrase that echoed like a whisper through her memory, "The truth of things best forgotten." The Colonel's words repeated by Lucy, and buried like a seed beneath layers of silence. A soft rap at her door broke her reverie. When she opened it, she found Inspector Craddock on the threshold, his overcoat glistening with rain. "Sorry to intrude at this hour, Miss Marple," he said, brushing off his hat, "but I'd rather hoped for a word before I head back to the station." "Of course, Inspector," she said, ushering him in. "You must be chilled to the bone. Sit down and I'll fetch you some tea." He smiled faintly. "I should have known you'd have the kettle ready." Moments later, as the fire crackled and the familiar scent of bergamot filled the air, Craddock leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "We've had a development. The missing tin box, well, we've found it, buried in the garden behind the cottage, under a bed of dead leaves. But it's empty. Empty," she repeated softly, her brow furrowing. "That's most enlightening." He looked puzzled. "Enlightening?" "Oh, yes," she said, pouring his tea. "It tells us, you see, that the thief did not mean to profit from the contents. If they had value, financial or otherwise, they would have been kept or sold. No, the purpose here was destruction. To erase, not to obtain." Craddock sipped his tea thoughtfully. "Then we're dealing with someone who feared exposure." "Precisely," Miss Marple said. The question, of course, is exposure of what? He sighed. I've been wondering the same. We've spoken again with Lucy Harcourt. She insists she knows nothing, though she admits her uncle had grown nervous these past weeks, talked of old mistakes and retribution. And here's another thing. Dr. Haydock confirmed that Mrs. Harcourt's death years ago might not have been as clear-cut as the Colonel claimed. The coroner ruled it accidental, but there were whispers even then. A fall from the balcony after an argument. Yes, Miss Marple said quietly. I remember it. She was a lovely woman, though delicate, far too sensitive for harsh words. Do you think the Colonel killed her? Miss Marple's eyes flickered toward the window, where rain traced thin silver lines against the glass. I think, she said slowly, that whatever happened that night was the beginning of everything that followed. Guilt can take many shapes, Inspector. It can hide behind anger, generosity, or even kindness. But it always leaves a mark. Craddock leaned back, watching her with a mixture of respect and frustration. You always make it sound so simple. It's human nature that's simple, she said gently. It's the lies we tell to protect it that make life complicated. He smiled wryly. You'd make a fine detective, Miss Marple. She gave a small laugh. Oh, dear me, no. I've merely lived long enough to see that people rarely change. They commit the same follies again and again, only the names and circumstances differ. They spoke a little longer, and when the inspector left, Miss Marple returned to her chair. She watched the rain until the fire burned down to embers. Then she rose, lit a candle, and took out her notebook, a modest little volume where she jotted fragments of thought. On one page she wrote 3 words in her tidy, slanted hand: fear, guilt, inheritance. Beneath them she added, Mrs. Bartlett, too eager. Lucy, too calm. Mrs. Briggs, too frightened. The next morning the rain had stopped, leaving behind a bright, deceptive calm. Birds sang again, and the air smelled clean and sharp. Yet the village carried its tension like a secret illness. Polite on the surface, feverish underneath. Miss Marple walked briskly to the church, where she found the vicar tending to a stack of hymn books. Good morning, Mr. Clement, she said pleasantly. I thought I might have a word about the Fate Fund. He looked up, flustered but smiling. Ah, yes, the money's safe, thank heaven. I was half afraid it had gone missing with everything else. Terrible business about the Colonel. And now this nonsense about burglars. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, terrible indeed. Though I don't believe we've had any burglars, Mr. Clement. Not in the usual sense. The vicar frowned. You think the thief was someone local? I think, she said softly, that we're dealing with something very close to home. But tell me, did you notice anything unusual the day of the fete? Anyone behaving oddly? He hesitated. Well, now that you mention it, Mrs. Bartlett did seem rather jumpy. Kept glancing toward the Colonel and Lucy, as if she expected trouble. I assume she was fretting over her jam display. Mrs. Bartlett always frets over something, Miss Marple murmured. And yet, she's not the kind to lose her composure without reason. I wonder what she saw. She left the vicar with his hymn books and made her way toward the tea rooms. Inside, the air was thick with the aroma of baked scones and the sweeter scent of gossip. Mrs. Bartlett was at her usual corner table, surrounded by her companions, her voice rising above theirs with all the self-importance of one who knows she is being listened to. Miss Marple, she called the moment she spotted her. You'll never believe it. The police found the Colonel's box, but empty. Shocking, isn't it? Why, it makes one afraid to so much as open one's cupboard. Miss Marple approached the table, her expression mild. Yes, quite distressing. Though I can't help wondering, Mrs. Bartlett, how you knew about the box. I was under the impression that detail hadn't been made public. For the first time, Mrs. Bartlett's composure faltered. Oh, well, I suppose someone mentioned it. The constable, perhaps. He's a dreadful talker, you know. Indeed, Miss Marple said. Still, it's remarkable how swiftly news travels in St. Mary Mead, sometimes even before it's known to those directly concerned. The colour rose in Mrs. Bartlett's cheeks. You have the oddest way of saying things, Miss Marple. So I've been told, she said pleasantly. Do forgive me, I must be going. I only came in to post a letter. As she left, she caught sight of Lucy crossing the street outside, her head bent beneath her hat. The girl moved quickly, almost furtively, and disappeared down the lane that led toward the old mill road, a path seldom used since the floods years ago. Miss Marple hesitated only a moment before following. The lane was muddy, the air damp with the scent of wet earth. Lucy stopped at the bend, unaware she was being observed. She knelt beside a fallen log, pulling something small from her coat pocket. A folded paper which she tore carefully into pieces before scattering them into the water that trickled by the road's edge. Then she stood, glanced about once, and hurried back toward the village. When she was gone, Miss Marple stepped closer. A few scraps of the paper had caught against a root, and though soaked, one word was still legible in the blurred ink. Forgive. Miss Marple stood very still. The pieces were aligning now, faintly but unmistakably. The Colonel's guilt, the missing confession, the frightened housekeeper, the niece burdened by secrets not her own. It was a tangle of protection and retribution, all centered on a death long past. As she turned back toward the village, a gust of wind carried the last of the paper fragments away, dissolving them into the stream. Miss Marple pulled her shawl closer and walked on, her thoughts sharpening with each step. Someone had tried to bury the past, and someone else had died for it. The question now was not who had killed Colonel Harcourt, but why now? And deep within her, Miss Marple felt the truth stir like a faint tremor beneath solid ground. The surface was beginning to crack, and soon everything hidden would rise to light. By the following afternoon, St. Mary Mead had resumed its ordinary rhythm on the surface, children running along the lanes, hens pecking in the dust, and the faint hum of a lawnmower drifting from a distant garden. Yet beneath that gentle facade, the village pulsed with unease. The mystery of Colonel Harcourt's death had rooted itself deep into conversation, and the newest rumor, that his niece had been seen walking alone by the old mill road, had added fresh fuel to the fire. Miss Marple, however, said nothing of what she had witnessed. She had learned long ago that truth revealed too soon tended to wither. It needed quiet, patience, and a touch of human folly to bring it to bloom. She spent the morning at her small writing desk, reviewing the notes she had made. Her tidy script filled several pages. Names, small habits, inconsistencies of speech. Mrs. Bartlett's knowledge of the tin box, Lucy's nervous secrecy, Mrs. Briggs's trembling fear, the Colonel's sudden change of will. Every thread seemed distinct, yet each one brushed against the next in some subtle, unspoken way. The key, she was certain, lay in the past, specifically in the death of Mrs. Harcourt, a tragedy that time had softened but never quite erased. Just as the clock struck 11, there came another knock at her door. It was Dr. Haydock, his usually ruddy face drawn with fatigue. "I've just come from the inquest continuation, Miss Marple," he said, removing his hat. "The coroner's not satisfied. He's ordered a further examination of the body. Something about the dosage not matching the symptoms." Miss Marple motioned for him to sit, pouring tea with her usual calm precision. "You mean the Colonel took less than he should have for a fatal dose?" "Precisely. By all accounts, there wasn't quite enough cyanide to kill a man of his constitution outright. It seems there must have been a contributing factor, perhaps another substance or some prior condition." "How very odd," she murmured, her eyes distant. "Almost as if the poison wasn't meant to kill at all, but to frighten," the doctor blinked. "To frighten? You mean an accident?" "Not an accident," she said softly. "An intention gone awry. Suppose, for instance, that the poisoner meant only to cause a scene, perhaps a collapse, a warning of sorts. A small measure could do that, couldn't it?" Haydock frowned. "It could, yes, but why? What purpose would that serve?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "To silence, perhaps. To deter someone from speaking. A dreadful irony if instead of silencing it killed." The doctor looked unsettled. "You have a dark imagination, Miss Marple. Not imagination, Doctor, observation. People rarely plan murder well. They act out of fear, anger, or desperation. Intentional deaths are tidy only in novels. Real ones are quite clumsy things. He rose after a time, clearly troubled. You're probably right, as usual. Still, I'll wager the police won't take kindly to the idea that their murderer didn't mean to murder. When he had gone, Miss Marple sat quietly, her tea cooling beside her. She thought again of Lucy on the mill road, scattering those pieces of paper. Forgive, the word had said. Forgive whom? Her uncle herself, or someone else entirely. There was only one way to know, and it would require delicacy. That afternoon she visited Blackthorn Cottage again. The police had finished their work for the day, and the house had regained a semblance of domestic order. Lucy greeted her at the door, visibly surprised. Miss Marple, how kind of you to call. Please come in. I'm afraid the place is in dreadful disarray. I never mind a little untidiness, Miss Marple said gently. It's a sign that life still stirs within a house. Quite the opposite of dreadfully neat ones, which often conceal stagnation or worse. Lucy smiled faintly, though her eyes remained guarded. Would you like some tea? Mrs. Briggs is out shopping, but I can manage. That would be lovely, my dear, Miss Marple said, seating herself by the window. From there she could see the garden, the patch of earth where the tin box had been found, and just beyond it, the old balcony that had once belonged to Mrs. Harcourt's room. Lucy busied herself at the tray, her hands steady this time, her composure almost deliberate. It must be strange for you, Miss Marple began conversationally, coming back to a house so full of memories. I imagine your aunt's presence lingers here still. Lucy paused, the teaspoon clinking lightly against the cup. Yes, she said after a moment, it does. She was kind to me, more than my uncle ever was, truthfully. I was very young when she died, but I remember her laughter. She wasn't suited to this place. It felt too small for her. Small places can be suffocating for those with secrets, Miss Marple said mildly. Tell me, my dear, do you believe your uncle loved her? Lucy turned sharply. Of course he did. Everyone said so. But what do you think? Lucy hesitated, then sank into the chair opposite. I don't know. I used to hear them argue. My aunt was unhappy. She wanted to leave once, but she didn't have the means. I think he felt humiliated by that. When she fell, when it happened, I remember how still he was. Not shocked, not broken, just cold. And afterward? He sent me away to school in Bath. I hardly saw him. But last month he wrote to me, asked me to come back. He said he wanted to make amends. Her voice trembled now. He said he wanted to tell me something about her death. Miss Marple's eyes softened. And he never did. No, Lucy whispered. He never did. They sat in silence for a moment, the ticking of the clock loud between them. Then Miss Marple spoke again, her voice thoughtful. It's an awful thing carrying someone else's guilt, my dear. It makes the innocent behave strangely, and the guilty seem blameless. But tell me, did you destroy something yesterday? Along the mill road, perhaps? Lucy's head jerked up, color flooding her cheeks. You saw me. Quite by accident, Miss Marple said kindly. I make it a rule never to misinterpret a young woman's need for privacy. But I thought perhaps you might want to unburden yourself. Tears welled suddenly in Lucy's eyes. It was a letter, she said, her voice breaking. A letter my uncle wrote the day before he died. I found it among his papers. It said terrible things, Miss Marple. He confessed that Aunt Clara's death wasn't an accident. She found out something about his business, something dreadful about money stolen from an investment in India. They quarreled. She threatened to expose him, and he pushed her. He said he never meant to, but he did. And then he lived with it all these years. Miss Marple's expression did not change, but her eyes grew very still. And you burned it to protect him? Lucy nodded miserably. I thought it was all over, until someone began sending him letters, threatening letters. That's why he called me home. He said he'd deal with it, that I wasn't to worry. But now he's dead too. And I can't help thinking whoever sent those letters Must have poisoned him. Miss Marple rose gently and took her hand. My dear child, you've done what you thought was right. But the truth has a way of demanding more than we intend to give it. I don't believe the person who sent those letters was your enemy. Quite the contrary. They may have been the one person who still sought justice for your aunt. Lucy looked stricken. You mean someone who knew her, perhaps, or someone who loved her? Miss Marple turned toward the window again, her eyes tracing the line of the garden wall where the tin box had been buried. Tell me, was Mrs. Briggs here when your aunt died? Yes, Lucy said faintly. She was the one who found her. Why? But Miss Marple only smiled her small, enigmatic smile. Because, my dear, some secrets are kept not out of fear of guilt, but out of love for the dead. And I rather think Mrs. Briggs has been keeping hers for a very long time. As she left the cottage, the sun was beginning to dip low, bathing the path in golden light. Miss Marple walked slowly, her thoughts clear now, her heart heavy but resolute. The circle was closing, as it always did, back to where it began, with a death that had never truly ended. And somewhere within the quiet heart of that house she knew, the truth waited, ready at last to be spoken aloud. Evening settled softly over St. Mary Mead, the air holding the faint scent of wood smoke, and the hush of a village reluctant to speak too loudly, after all that had transpired. Miss Marple, walking home from Blackthorn Cottage, felt the weight of the conversation still pressing against her thoughts. Lucy's confession had illuminated much, but not enough. The truth, as it so often did, lay not in the grand moments of confession, but in the small tremors of behavior, those quiet gestures that betrayed far more than words ever could. She had seen one such tremor earlier that afternoon, and it had belonged to Mrs. Briggs. The woman's eyes, when Lucy had spoken of the letter and the confession, had darted to the fire as though remembering something she had wished to forget. It was not the fear of guilt she had seen there. It was the fear of knowledge. The next morning broke sharp and bright, the kind of day that promised renewal, though it carried no comfort. Miss Marple's breakfast tray lay untouched as she sat by her window, watching the lane. At 9:30 she rose, fetched her shawl, and made her way toward the cottage once more. She found Mrs. Briggs in the garden, stooping to prune the roses, her thick gloves streaked with soil. The woman started at the sound of footsteps. "Oh, Miss Marple, you startled me. I didn't hear you come up." "My dear, one seldom hears what one doesn't expect," Miss Marple said kindly. "May I trouble you for a moment?" "I shan't keep you from your work long." Mrs. Briggs wiped her hands on her apron. "Of course, ma'am. Though I must say I can't think what else there is to tell. The inspector's asked enough questions to fill a book." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Indeed he has. But I don't believe he's asked the most important one." The woman frowned, her hands twisting in her apron. "And what question might that be?" "Not how the Colonel died," Miss Marple said softly. "But why now?" The truth of Mrs. Harcourt's death had been buried all these years. The Colonel lived in peace, or something like it, until recently. And then all of a sudden came the letters, the threats, the fear. What changed? Mrs. Briggs looked away, her shoulders stiffening. "You should ask someone else, Miss Marple." "I keep to myself. Always have." "That may be true," Miss Marple said gently. "But I think you've also kept something else, something that's weighed on you a very long time." She paused, her tone still mild but deliberate. "You see, I spoke with Lucy yesterday. She told me her uncle's letter confessed to killing his wife. But you and I both know that isn't quite true, don't we?" Mrs. Briggs froze, her breath catching. How could you say such a thing?" "Because, my dear, I've seen grief and guilt too many times to mistake one for the other. The Colonel's fear these past weeks wasn't that someone would discover his guilt, but that the truth would reveal he'd carried another's burden. He was protecting someone." Mrs. Briggs's face had gone pale, and her hands trembled as she reached for the back of the garden bench. Please, Miss Marple, I don't want to talk about that night." Miss Marple's voice softened further. "Then let me tell you what I believe, and you need only tell me if I'm wrong. Your mistress, Mrs. Harcourt, found out about the Colonel's business dealings, perhaps even accused him of theft. They argued, yes, but it wasn't he who pushed her. It was you. You were devoted to her, weren't you? You saw her despair, her unhappiness, and when she tried to leave, you tried to stop her. There was a struggle. She fell. It was an accident, but one you couldn't live with. The Colonel found her, and rather than see you ruined, he took the blame onto himself. For a long time, the only sound was the faint buzz of a bee in the roses. Then Mrs. Briggs sank slowly onto the bench, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "How could you know?" she whispered. "I've never told a soul." Miss Marple sat beside her, her manner as gentle as if speaking to a frightened child. "Because I've seen it before, my dear. Good people do foolish things out of love. The Colonel was no saint, but he was loyal to those he cared for. He could live with guilt, but not with gratitude unearned. And so he bore your sin quietly." Mrs. Briggs bowed her head, her voice trembling. "It was an accident, just as you said. She was leaving. She'd packed her jewels and said she'd never come back. I begged her to wait for the Colonel to return, to talk it over. She pushed past me. There was a loose board on the balcony, and before I could stop her—" She broke off, sobbing. "He came in a moment later. He saw me kneeling there beside her. I told him I'd call the police, that I'd tell them the truth. But he wouldn't hear of it. Said no one would believe it was an accident, that I'd hang for it. He made it all right with the authorities somehow, told them it was a tragic fall. And then he made me promise never to speak of it again." Miss Marple placed a hand over hers. "And you kept that promise even when it poisoned both your lives." Mrs. Briggs nodded miserably. "I thought it was over. But then the letters started coming. He grew pale and ill-tempered, said someone knew. I told him we should go to the police, but he said it would only make things worse. And now he's dead." She looked up suddenly, her expression fearful. "Do you think— oh God, do you think whoever sent those letters killed him?" "I think," Miss Marple said quietly, "that whoever sent them didn't mean to. But yes, I believe the letters and the poison came from the same hand." Mrs. Briggs stared. "You mean Lucy?" Miss Marple's eyes were distant. "I mean someone whose grief has been festering too long. The poison wasn't meant to kill, it was meant to frighten, to punish. Lucy believed her uncle murdered her aunt. She sought justice in the only way she could bear. But she miscalculated. She didn't know about you, nor that he had once confessed falsely to spare you. When she learned of that letter, she must have thought it proof of his guilt. Poor child. She must have believed she was avenging her aunt's death." Mrs. Briggs covered her mouth, her voice breaking. "She didn't mean—" "No," Miss Marple said softly. "She didn't mean to kill him. She wanted only to make him suffer the way she believed her aunt had. That's why the dose was small, but fear makes fools of us all. And fear mixed with love can be deadly." They sat in silence for some time, the truth lying heavy between them. Finally Miss Marple rose, her expression serene but grave. "So you must tell the inspector everything, Mrs. Briggs. He'll believe you. He's a good man. Lucy's burden must be lifted, and so must yours. The Colonel would have wanted peace for you both." Mrs. Briggs nodded slowly, tears sliding down her weathered face. "Do you think God forgives something like this, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I should hope so, my dear. He's had enough practice with the rest of us." That evening, as the sun dipped low over the cottages, Miss Marple walked back through the quiet lanes. The village looked almost serene again, the smoke from chimneys rising straight and thin against the reddening sky. But she knew that by morning the calm would break once more. There would be arrests, statements, tears, yet beneath it all a strange sense of release. The truth, though painful, would heal more than it harmed. When she reached her gate, she paused to look back toward Blackthorn Cottage. The windows glowed faintly with lamplight. In her mind's eye she saw Lucy inside, unaware that the truth she had sought so fervently was already moving toward her. Kindly, inexorably, and with the quiet hand of justice. Miss Marple went in, set down her shawl, and took her knitting once more. The pattern came easily now, each stitch finding its place, each thread connecting neatly to the next. Outside, the first stars appeared. Inside, the gentle click of her needles marked the slow rhythm of resolution, as if the universe itself had begun at last to untangle its knots. The following day dawned calm and pale, as though the village itself were holding its breath. Yet the quiet of St. Mary Mead was deceptive. Behind lace curtains and garden hedges, speculation thrived. The police had been seen at Blackthorn Cottage again, and Mrs. Briggs's weeping had been overheard by the milkman. Miss Marple, who had lived long enough to recognize the rhythm of scandal, knew that pity was often the first mask curiosity wore. She had slept little. Her conversation with Mrs. Briggs lingered in her mind, but so too did something else, a question that refused to settle. If Lucy had truly meant to frighten her uncle, how had she obtained the poison? Cyanide was not something a young woman could simply find. It required access, and that meant another hand might yet be involved. Miss Marple had seen before how guilt and love tangled themselves into knots. She suspected one such knot remained. After breakfast she walked to the vicarage. The October air was crisp, and a faint smoke from early fires hung over the cottages. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, greeted her at the door, flustered but pleased. "Jane, you've heard the news, of course. They say Lucy Harcourt is to be questioned again this morning." Miss Marple nodded mildly. "I expected as much." Mrs. Clement lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Between you and me, I think the inspector's had enough of secrets. He's been seen going in and out of the chemist's shop. Mark my words, Jane, the poison came from there. That would be the simplest explanation," Miss Marple said, her eyes thoughtful. "And yet simplicity is such a dangerous comfort, don't you think?" The vicar's wife blinked. "Whatever do you mean?" "Only that people prefer clear answers, even when the truth is seldom clear." She smiled kindly. "But I should go. I promised myself a little errand before luncheon." Her errand, as it happened, took her past the very same chemist's shop. She paused outside for a moment, studying the display of liniments and cough drops before stepping in. Mr. Benson, the chemist, was polishing a glass jar of camphor oil. He looked up with a start, then brightened. "Ah, Miss Marple, always a pleasure. What can I get for you today?" "Oh, just a little tincture of valerian," she said pleasantly. "I find it helps one think clearly when the mind is crowded with things one would rather not think about." He nodded sympathetically. "Quite right, quite right. I dare say the whole village has been rather unsettled since the fete." "Yes," she said softly. "Such a dreadful thing. And to think poison of all things so uncivilized. I imagine you must be quite accustomed to keeping such substances locked away." "Indeed, Miss Marple. Cyanide's not something one leaves lying about. Strictly controlled. Only used in small quantities for pest control, rats, you know. Farmers mostly. But I keep the key myself." "How very wise," she murmured. "Though I dare say not everyone is so cautious. You've had many assistants over the years, haven't you?" Mr. Benson puffed his chest slightly. "Oh, a few apprentices come and go. Young Tom Briggs, Mrs. Briggs's son, worked here last year before taking that job in Eastbourne. Clever lad, but restless. Couldn't settle." Miss Marple smiled. "Mrs. Briggs must be proud of him." He hesitated. "Well, she was, I suppose, though I heard he's fallen on hard times lately. Wrote to her asking for money, so they say. Still, she's a good woman. She'd help him if she could." When Miss Marple left the shop, her expression was unreadable, but her steps quickened slightly as she made her way back to her cottage. The pieces were beginning to align once more, not neatly, but with the unmistakable pull of pattern. A son who knew his mother's secret, a poison he could access, a desperate act disguised as justice. It was, she thought, a story of inheritance in more ways than one. By afternoon, Inspector Craddock appeared at her door. His face was drawn, his voice low. "I thought you should know, Miss Marple. We've taken Lucy Harcourt into custody." She confessed to sending the letters, said she only wanted to frighten her uncle. Claims she ordered a small amount of cyanide through the post, pretending it was for photography work. "We'll verify, of course, but it's enough for now." Miss Marple looked at him for a long moment. "Does that explanation satisfy you, Inspector?" He frowned. "It fits the facts." "Doesn't it?" "Perhaps," she said quietly. "But you must ask yourself whether it fits the people. Lucy may have sent the letters, but the poison, no. She wouldn't risk discovery through post orders. Too visible, too deliberate. The fear she carried was the fear of moral judgment, not law. She's not a woman who kills, Inspector. Not even by accident." Craddock sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "You have a talent for making a man doubt his own case." "Not doubt, Inspector, clarify." She smiled faintly. "If you wish to know where the poison came from, you might start with someone who had both access and a reason to use it. Someone who loved Mrs. Harcourt as fiercely as the Colonel once did, and who might have felt her death never truly ended." He stared at her for a moment, before his eyes widened slightly. "You mean Mrs. Briggs?" "I mean her son," Miss Marple said softly. "Tom Briggs." Craddock straightened. "But he's not been in the village for months, hasn't he? There are ways to return unnoticed. He knew the cottage well, knew where the safe was kept, and if I'm not mistaken, he would have known his mother's old guilt. If he learned that his mother had confessed her part to the Colonel, he might have feared exposure or disgrace. Or perhaps he believed the Colonel had blackmailed her all these years. Either way, fear makes strange bedfellows of vengeance and protection." Craddock said nothing for several seconds. Then slowly he nodded. "We'll look into it." The inspector left, and the hours drifted by in silence. Evening descended once again upon St. Mary Mead, the lamps flickering to life one by one. Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting untouched, her thoughts with the Briggs family. Guilt, she knew, was rarely solitary. It moved like a shadow, passing from one generation to the next, until someone at last turned to face it. It was nearly midnight when she heard hurried footsteps on the path outside. A knock followed, urgent, trembling. She rose and opened the door to find Mrs. Briggs standing there, her face ashen, her hands clutched around a crumpled letter. "He's gone, Miss Marple," she whispered. "My boy, Tom. He came this afternoon, said he had to see me before leaving again. He looked wild, pale as chalk. He said he'd done something foolish, something he couldn't undo. And then he left this." She held out the letter, her fingers shaking. Miss Marple took it gently and read in silence. The handwriting was uneven, the ink blotted. "I only meant to make him afraid, Mother. To make him see what he'd done to Aunt Clara and to you. I took the bottle from Mr. Benson's store. I thought a drop would scare him, nothing more. But it went wrong. I didn't mean it to go so far. Forgive me." Mrs. Briggs wept quietly, and Miss Marple placed a comforting arm around her shoulders. There, my dear," she murmured. "The truth always comes whether we invite it or not. Your son must answer for his actions, but at least the burden is shared now. Secrets lose their power when spoken aloud." Outside, the wind had risen again, sweeping through the darkened lanes of St. Mary Mead, carrying with it the faint tolling of the church bell. Miss Marple stood by the window long after Mrs. Briggs had gone, her gaze fixed on the dim outline of Blackthorn Cottage. The lights there had gone out, but in her mind the story still glowed, its final threads tightening. Tomorrow, she knew, would bring the reckoning. The truth at last had shown its face, and though it was tragic, it was also inevitably human. Dawn came grey and low, the clouds pressing close over the thatched roofs of St. Mary Mead. The village was subdued, its gossip muted now that the truth had begun to emerge. Yet Miss Marple knew that gossip, like guilt, never truly disappeared. It simply changed shape. By breakfast time, word had already reached every doorstep. Tom Briggs had been found near the old railway crossing just outside the village, alive though injured. The police had discovered him wandering along the track, feverish and confused. In his coat pocket, they had found the empty phial from which the cyanide had been drawn. When Inspector Craddock called on Miss Marple later that morning, He looked more tired than she had ever seen him. "It's over, more or less," he said, taking off his hat. "We found the boy as you said we would. He'll recover physically, though he's in a state of shock. Confessed everything once we got him settled at the hospital. It's just as you deduced. He took the poison from Benson's store, slipped it into the Colonel's tea himself. Said he only meant to give him a fright, just like you thought." He paused, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's a damned tragic business, Miss Marple. The whole family ruined by something that should have been buried long ago." Miss Marple poured tea without a word, her expression calm, but her eyes thoughtful. "It's seldom what's buried that causes the ruin, Inspector," she said gently. "It's the silence afterward, the refusal to tend to what festers underneath. People think by not speaking they preserve peace, but all they do is let pain take root." He sighed. "You're right. The Colonel took on guilt that wasn't his. The boy grew up believing his mother had been wronged. And Lucy, well, she believed her uncle was a murderer. That kind of history poisons a household more surely than any chemical." Miss Marple stirred her cup slowly, her knitting resting beside her. "Poor Mrs. Briggs," she murmured. "I fear she'll bear the heaviest burden of all. A mother always does in the end." Craddock nodded, rising after a moment. "I'll be heading to the hospital shortly. The boy keeps asking for his mother. She'll need to see him before we take him away." When he left, Miss Marple remained seated, her mind turning over the details one last time. Every piece of the puzzle was now in its place, yet she felt no triumph. There was only sadness, the quiet, inevitable sorrow of human frailty. She thought of Lucy, who had sought vengeance out of love, and of Tom, whose misguided loyalty had led him down a darker path. The Colonel's death, she realized, was not the crime itself, but the echo of an older one, the sin of concealment, of hearts too proud to confess. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple walked to the hospital at the edge of Much Benham, where Tom Briggs lay under police watch. The nurse on duty, who knew Miss Marple well enough not to question her presence, nodded her through. Inside the small ward, Tom lay pale against the sheets, his eyes closed, his breathing shallow but steady. Mrs. Briggs sat at his bedside, her hand gripping his, her face drawn with exhaustion and grief. When she saw Miss Marple, she tried to rise, but Miss Marple gestured gently for her to remain seated. "How is he?" she asked softly. Mrs. Briggs's voice was a hoarse whisper. "He keeps saying he didn't mean it, Miss Marple. That he only wanted the Colonel to admit what he'd done. He thought my secret was his burden to write. Oh, what have I done? If only I'd told him sooner." Miss Marple placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "My dear, it was love that guided you, not malice. But love can blind us as surely as hate. You wanted to protect him from a truth you thought too heavy for him. He wanted to protect you from a past you could no longer bear. Both of you were trying to heal the same wound." Mrs. Briggs looked at her son, tears spilling down her cheeks. "He was such a good boy once. Always kind, always thoughtful. When his father died, I thought he'd be the one thing in my life that remained unspoiled. Goodness doesn't vanish because of a single terrible act," Miss Marple said quietly. "It only falters. He'll carry the weight of what he's done, but perhaps that will be his way of understanding the mercy his uncle once showed you." The woman nodded weakly, her gaze fixed on the boy's still hand. "Will they hang him, Miss Marple?" "No," she said softly. "The inspector will see to that. They'll call it manslaughter, an accident born of recklessness. The courts are not without compassion, and Craddock is not without heart. The truth, once spoken, has a way of softening even the hardest judgment." Mrs. Briggs covered her face with her hands, sobbing quietly. Miss Marple stayed beside her until the tears subsided, then rose silently and stepped out into the corridor. The nurse looked up as she passed, but Miss Marple only gave a slight nod. Outside, the afternoon light was wan and pale, but the air felt cleaner somehow. The truth, painful though it was, had purged something from the air of St. Mary Mead. She walked home slowly, her footsteps steady against the lane. The fields stretched gold and green on either side, and she thought, not for the first time, that the countryside had an odd indifference to human suffering. It went on blooming regardless. When she reached her gate, she found Lucy Harcourt waiting there, her face pale but composed. "Miss Marple," she said softly, "they told me everything. About Tom, about my aunt, about Uncle Henry. I can hardly believe it. Sometimes—" "My dear," Miss Marple said, opening the gate, "we live so long beside a lie that the truth feels unnatural when it finally appears. Come inside." Lucy followed her into the sitting room, taking the chair by the fire. For a long time neither spoke. The sound of the mantel clock filled the silence. At last Lucy said, "I wanted to hate him forever. I thought he was cruel. But he wasn't, was he? He carried the blame so no one else would suffer." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, he bore the sin out of love. Love for your aunt, for Mrs. Briggs, even for you. That kind of love is heavy and flawed, but it is love all the same." Lucy's eyes filled with tears. "And now Tom, he'll pay for it too. It's as if the same curse keeps passing on. Not a curse, my dear. A consequence. But consequences can end where understanding begins. You have the power to do that, to forgive them both and yourself." Lucy looked into the fire, her expression thoughtful, subdued. "Do you really believe forgiveness changes anything?" "I do," Miss Marple said softly. "It changes everything, because it is the one thing evil never expects. Guilt breeds secrecy, and secrecy breeds fear. But forgiveness, well, that brings truth into the open, and truth, once revealed, has no more power to harm." Lucy rose after a while, her face calmer, her voice steady. "I'll go see Mrs. Briggs tomorrow. She shouldn't be alone. I think Uncle Henry would have wanted that." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes, my dear, I believe he would." When the girl had gone, Miss Marple stood by the window, watching the fading light settle over the roofs of St. Mary Mead. The world looked ordinary again, peaceful, almost deceptively so, but she knew better than to believe in surface peace. Beneath the quiet, people still carried their private burdens, their small shames and quiet griefs. She also knew that in time those burdens would surface too, just as surely as the truth had surfaced now. She sat down, took up her knitting once more, and began a new pattern, fine, careful, deliberate. The steady click of the needles soothed her. She had seen another piece of human nature unfold, and as always it ended not with triumph, but with the weary grace of understanding. For in St. Mary Mead, as in the wider world, evil rarely arrived in grand guises. It crept in gently, dressed in good intentions, and left behind only the quiet wreckage of the human heart. The clock struck 6. Miss Marple laid down her knitting and smiled faintly to herself. Tomorrow would bring its own troubles, garden gossip, the post, perhaps a visit from the vicar's wife. But tonight, for the first time in many weeks, she felt something like peace. The truth had done its work. The dead were at rest. And Miss Marple, with her sharp eyes and gentle wisdom, had once again reminded the world that the smallest observations often reveal the deepest crimes, and just as often, the deepest acts of love. The morning after the truth had settled over St. Mary Mead dawned with the quiet grace of a village exhaling at last. The mist lifted lazily from the fields, and the sparrows returned to their chatter along the church eaves. Yet beneath that surface calm, traces of sorrow lingered like faint fingerprints, unseen but unmistakable to those who knew where to look. Miss Marple, who knew the village as one knows the lines of one's own hand, could feel it in the stillness of the air, in the careful tone of greetings exchanged at the post office, in the way even Mrs. Price Ridley's voice had softened to a whisper. It was the peculiar hush that followed scandal, a blend of relief and unease. At her breakfast table, Miss Marple read the morning paper without seeing the words. She had slept little, her thoughts returning again and again to Mrs. Briggs and her son. The inspector had called late the previous evening, confirming that Tom had confessed in full and would be transferred to the county jail once he was deemed fit to travel. The law would deal with him mercifully, Craddock had said, since no malice was proven. Yet Miss Marple knew that no court's mercy could rival the punishment of conscience. She wondered, not without tenderness, what sort of future could possibly await a young man whose every mistake had been born of love. By mid-morning, she decided to visit Mrs. Briggs. The day was crisp, the lanes lined with glistening hedgerows, and the autumn sun filtered softly through drifting clouds. As she neared Blackthorn Cottage, she saw Lucy standing by the gate, her coat buttoned against the chill. The girl looked older somehow, though only a few days had passed since the fete. Grief had refined her, Miss Marple thought, burnished her innocence into something quieter, deeper. "Miss Marple," Lucy said, her voice subdued but steady. "I was just going to see Mrs. Briggs. I couldn't stay away. It feels unfinished." Miss Marple gave a small approving nod. "Most things in life are, my dear, but it's kind of you to go. She'll need comfort more than she'll admit." They walked together up the garden path. The roses, which had once been the pride of the Colonel's wife, were still in bloom. Late survivors, their petals bruised by the cold. Mrs. Briggs opened the door herself, her eyes red but dry. She looked smaller than usual, diminished not by guilt but by the release of it. "Come in, both of you," she said softly. "I was making tea. It's strange, isn't it? Habit doesn't die even when everything else seems to." They entered the familiar sitting room. The air carried a faint scent of polish and lavender, though the fire was low and the shadows long. Lucy took a seat by the window, gazing out at the garden while Mrs. Briggs busied herself with the teapot. "Tom's to be moved tomorrow," Mrs. Briggs said, her hands trembling slightly as she poured. "Inspector Craddock says it will be all right. He's been very kind." "He's a good man," Miss Marple agreed, "and he knows when punishment has already been paid." Mrs. Briggs sank into a chair opposite them. "He's my boy, Miss Marple. No matter what's happened, he's still my boy. I keep thinking of him as a little lad, running through that very garden, laughing. I suppose mothers always remember the laughter best." Miss Marple reached over and patted her hand gently. "And so you should, my dear. It's the good in our memories that allows the rest to fade." Lucy turned from the window, her expression troubled. "Mrs. Briggs, I've been thinking about everything that's happened. I can't undo what my family's done to yours, but I'd like to help if I can. The house, Blackthorn Cottage, it's mine now, you know. Uncle Henry's will made sure of that. But I couldn't bear to live here, not after all that's happened. I thought perhaps if you wanted, you might stay on. Look after the place until things are settled." Mrs. Briggs stared at her, her eyes wide with disbelief. "You'd let me stay here?" "It's yours more than it's mine," Lucy said softly. "It always was. My aunt loved you. My uncle trusted you, and Tom, well, he'll need a home to come back to someday. Let it be here." The older woman's mouth trembled, and she pressed a hand to her lips. "Oh, child, that's more kindness than I deserve." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Deserving rarely has anything to do with kindness. It's the undeserved sort that saves us in the end." For a time they sat in silence, the crackle of the fire and the tick of the clock the only sounds in the room. Outside, a soft rain began to fall, its rhythm steady and comforting. It seemed to Miss Marple that the house itself was exhaling, a weary sigh of release after years of holding its breath. Later, when she took her leave, Lucy walked with her as far as the lane. The air smelled of wet earth and fallen leaves. "Miss Marple," Lucy said suddenly, "how do you bear it, knowing so much about what people hide? I think if I understood half of what you do, I'd never sleep again." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Ah, my dear, I sleep quite soundly. You see, I've learned that wickedness and goodness live side by side in everyone. Once you accept that, the world becomes less frightening. People aren't monsters, they're simply flawed. And when you stop expecting perfection, you stop being shocked by imperfection." Lucy looked down, thoughtful. "I hope I can learn that." "You will," Miss Marple said. "Pain teaches it, whether we wish to learn or not." When they parted, Miss Marple continued along the lane, her umbrella tapping lightly against the stones. She stopped once, turning back to glance at the cottage. Smoke rose gently from its chimney now, curling upward like a promise. The sight warmed her more than she cared to admit. She had seen enough endings to know that healing often began in such small, unremarkable moments. That evening the vicar and his wife called in for tea, as they often did after a village storm had passed. Mrs. Clement, ever curious, was quick to bring up the affair. "Such a tragic story, Jane, and to think it all began at the fete. I told Mr. Clement that nothing good ever comes of too much gaiety." The vicar smiled tolerantly. "Now, my dear, we mustn't be morbid." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "Tragedy seldom needs gaiety to begin, my dear Mrs. Clement. It only needs human nature, and that's in abundance everywhere." Mrs. Clement sighed, half pleased, half reproachful. "You do have the strangest way of putting things, Jane." The vicar leaned forward, smiling warmly. "You'll admit, though, she's almost always right." Miss Marple returned the smile, her eyes twinkling. "So not always, Mr. Clement. I'm merely observant. Life is full of patterns, and people are terribly fond of repeating them. It only takes a little patience to see how one small deceit can bloom into calamity." Mrs. Clement shivered lightly. "Oh, you make it sound inevitable." "Not inevitable," Miss Marple said softly, setting down her cup. "Just natural. But nature, you see, has its own way of setting things right. The truth may be painful, but it always restores balance in the end." When her guests departed and the house fell quiet once more, Miss Marple lit a single lamp and returned to her knitting. Outside the rain had stopped, leaving the night clear and sharp. The stars hung low above the rooftops, their light faint but steady. She thought of the Colonel, of Mrs. Harcourt, of Lucy and Tom and Mrs. Briggs. The threads of their lives had been tangled cruelly, yet somehow in unravelling them, something honest had been mended. Her needles moved steadily, click by click, each loop precise. There was comfort in the repetition, in the order it restored. As the fire dwindled and the room filled with the soft ticking of the clock, Miss Marple's expression grew serene. The mystery of Blackthorn Cottage was finished now, not in triumph but in quiet understanding. Life would go on in St. Mary Mead as it always did, with new secrets, small scandals, and the endless, familiar rhythm of human hearts, fragile, foolish, and forever fascinating. When at last she set her knitting aside, Miss Marple looked toward the window, where the moonlight pooled on the sill. "Poor souls," she murmured. "They'll manage." And then, with the faintest smile, she turned out the lamp, the room falling softly into darkness, the peace of resolution settling like dust upon everything left unsaid. The next morning brought with it a calm that felt almost foreign after so many days of tension. St. Mary Mead had resumed its quiet rhythm, though an unspoken understanding lingered among its inhabitants. The village had seen one of its own tested and broken, and such things left faint scars on even the most routine lives. Yet as the church bell tolled across the green and the postman made his rounds, there was at last a sense of something settled, something righted. Miss Marple rose earlier than usual, drawn by the soft golden light creeping through her curtains. She took her breakfast by the window, her gaze drifting across the rooftops to where Blackthorn Cottage stood beyond the hedgerows, its chimney sending up a faint wisp of smoke. It struck her, not for the first time, how peaceful the scene appeared from a distance, how deceivingly peaceful. The human heart, she mused, was much the same. One could never quite see what smouldered quietly within until the smoke began to rise. A knock at her door broke her reverie. It was Inspector Craddock, hat in hand, his expression sober but gentler than she'd seen it in days. "Miss Marple," he began, "I've just come from the hospital. Tom Briggs has been moved to county custody. The doctors say he'll recover in time. He's remorseful, says he'll tell the magistrate everything. Seems to want nothing more than to clear his mother's name." Miss Marple nodded. "That's as it should be. The poor boy has carried the burden of misunderstanding far too long." Craddock sighed. "It's strange, isn't it? One small lie, told in the name of protection, and before you know it, you've got 3 lives destroyed. She gave him a small, knowing smile. "Oh, my dear Inspector, it was not the lie that destroyed them, it was the silence that followed it. People often mistake silence for peace, but peace built on fear is only a quieter form of war." He looked at her with quiet admiration. "You always see right through it, don't you?" "Not always," she said, folding her hands. "But human nature, Inspector, is much like knitting. Tangles are inevitable, but if one has patience and an understanding of the pattern, the threads do tend to reveal where they went wrong." He chuckled softly. "Well, the village owes you its thanks once again, Miss Marple, though I doubt anyone quite realizes how close they came to tragedy." "I shouldn't like them to," she replied gently. "It's enough that they remember the cost of secrets. Besides, St. Mary Mead prefers its mysteries tidy and far away. It would rather not know how near the darkness lives." Craddock lingered a moment longer, as if reluctant to break the spell of calm that always seemed to settle in her presence. Then, with a polite bow of his head, he took his leave, and Miss Marple watched him go down the garden path until he disappeared round the bend. The afternoon brought a soft rain that blurred the village edges into watercolour hues. Miss Marple took her knitting to the hearth, the steady rhythm of her needles a familiar comfort. She thought of Lucy, who had stopped by earlier with news that Mrs. Briggs would remain at Blackthorn Cottage, tending to the house and garden as she always had. Lucy herself planned to leave for London soon. For a while, she'd said. There was forgiveness in her voice, hesitant but sincere, and Miss Marple had felt something within her ease at that. The girl would heal. Youth always did, given time. As evening fell, a faint knock came once more. When Miss Marple opened the door, Mrs. Briggs stood there, her shawl damp from the mist, her face pale but composed. In her hand she held a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "I wanted you to have this," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It was the Colonel's. He used to keep it locked away, the tin box. I found it again while tidying his study. There's nothing in it now, but I thought, perhaps it's safer with you." Miss Marple accepted it quietly. "Thank you, my dear. Some things are lighter when passed on." Mrs. Briggs hesitated. "Do you think he's at peace now, Miss Marple, after all he carried?" The old woman's eyes softened. "Yes," she said. "He found his peace when he took the blame. It was his way of loving, though a misguided one. And now that the truth is known, he can rest, as we all must once we've done what we can." Mrs. Briggs nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "You've been very kind. To all of us," Miss Marple smiled faintly. "It costs nothing to be kind, my dear, and yet it buys more peace than most people ever realize." When the woman had gone, Miss Marple carried the little box to her desk and set it down. She traced its worn edges, then opened it. Inside lay a single folded slip of paper she had not expected, a remnant overlooked. It bore the Colonel's handwriting, faint but legible. "Truth waits, even when men will not." She read it twice, then closed the lid and sat for a long moment, the words lingering in her mind. Outside, the rain had ceased. The evening air carried the scent of damp earth and wood smoke, that peculiar sweetness that followed every cleansing storm. Miss Marple rose, lit her lamp, and took her place once more by the fire. The world, she thought, was endlessly forgiving in its cycles. The dead gave way to the living, guilt to grace, and even the most tangled mysteries unraveled in time. It was not triumph that satisfied her, nor even justice, but understanding, that quiet recognition of how easily people erred, and how rarely they meant to. As the firelight flickered against the lace curtains, she let her knitting fall to her lap. The village beyond her window was still. Somewhere in the distance, the church bell tolled once, its note drifting through the mist like a benediction. Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself. "The world is never wicked," she murmured, "only human," and with that she leaned back in her chair, the gentle glow of the fire reflected in her calm, knowing eyes, the eyes of a woman who had seen too much, forgiven much more, and understood better than anyone the quiet, fragile decency at the heart of even the darkest souls. Outside, St. Mary Mead slept peacefully once more, its secrets spent, its gardens glistening beneath the moon. The truth had come home at last to Blackthorn Cottage, and in that truth, gentle, tragic and whole, the village found its way back to the simple, enduring rhythm of life.